Hello viewers, how are you? This is going to be my third video that explores the albums, the great albums of 1974. Albums which this year at some point will become 50 years old. Albums that we're still talking about now because they were so great. In that respect, they are the great achievements, artistic achievements of the 20th century. Right, so it's pretty important what's going on here. On Monday, I discussed my 10 favourite jazz rock albums. On Wednesday, I went through my 10 favourite progressive rock albums. On here, I'm going to be going through my 5 hard rock, heavy rock albums. Only 5. You want to know why? I'll tell you in a minute. I'm also going to be going through my 5 favourite funk albums. Alright? Now, why? Well, I'll tell you why. Because I was originally thought, well, early 70s for me, 74, it's about progressive rock, it's about fusion, but it's also about rock. It's about Led Zeppelin, it's about Free, it's about Black Sabbath, it's about Judas Priest. That's what the 70s is about for me. And I thought, I've got to go through my favourite rock albums from that era. So I start to go through those albums. And there's hardly any. There's hardly any. The albums that are there are not albums that I particularly listen to. So Queen 2 and Sheer Heart Attack, that are really great rock albums, won't be in my list because for me, I love the Seven Seas of Ryan, all those tracks, they were great. But I was never a big Queen fan coming up. It would be not right to put them on a list of my favourite albums. And then after that, I couldn't find the rock albums. And I thought, what's going on here? What's Judas Priest up to? And Judas Priest brought out Rock and Roller in this era, which is, for me, is not Judas Priest. They haven't found their sound. So what we see here with rock music are the same cracks appearing that we see with progressive rock music. But the critical critical narrative is that prog got too outlandish and then punk came along and destroyed it. And everyone realised the errors of their ways. That's the sort of critical narrative when it comes to prog. That doesn't get applied to rock music. No one ever said that happened to Led Zeppelin or Deep Purple. But we see that first wave of hard rock, heavy rock bands, don't want to call them heavy metal bands, but in my day we would have called them heavy metal bands, but they're now called hard rock, heavy rock. Those bands, the cracks are starting to appear in the same way they're appearing in 1974 in progressive rock. It's really interesting. A lot of classic rock bands have run out of steam. A lot of classic rock bands are not making a record this year after making a lot of records. Led Zeppelin being the example. Where's the classic album from 74? There isn't one. They have had that run up to Houses of the Holy, and then in 1975 they're going to bring out Physical Graffiti, which they had trouble making. You know, John Paul Jones left the band while they were making that, and that album was pulled together by a whole ton of other tracks that were rejected from the first 4 or 5 albums, right? From 74 on, Zeppelin are going to struggle. They're going to struggle with Presence. They're going to struggle with In Through the Idol for a whole host of reasons. We could argue that in terms of Led Zeppelin, they're irrevocably changed in 1974. These bands, I think, are running out of steam. In terms of Black Sabbath and Deep Purple, which are the other 2 great heavy rock bands of the early 70s for me, there are 2 albums that come out there in 74 which are absolutely brilliant albums, and they've made the list. But after that, think about it. Try and think of a really, truly great classic rock album from 74. It's really difficult. Bands like Judas Priest, bands like Iron Maiden, they're still yet to come. You know, this second wave are going to come in with something else. And of course, what people are going to say is that this is the influence of punk. But if you look at this list, it's there earlier on. And I'm going to try and discuss that. It's only 5 albums, because truly that was all I could come up with from this year for hard rock, heavy rock. Right, so at number 5 on my list of my favourite heavy rock albums from 1974, we have Phenomenon by UFO. UFO are one of my favourite rock bands of all time. I grew up listening to Strangers of the Night. I think it's one of the greatest rock albums ever. I think Michael Schenker was a genius. Of course, UFO were rubbish till Michael Schenker came on. It's an awful, meandering blues rock, psychedelic rock band that if anybody comes on and says, I think those first 2 albums by UFO are great, well, just you off your head. Right, UFO are not great until when Michael Schenker joins the band. He's in his teens when he joins. He's made 1 album with his Scorpions with his brother Rudolph, and then he jumps over to UFO. And he brings in a couple of compositions which appear on this album, and they're 2 of UFO's greatest tracks. One is Doctor Doctor, which eventually becomes a huge hit record for them, and the other is Rock Bottom, which on Stranger of the Night becomes the sort of centrepiece for Michael Schenker to just show what an incredible guitarist he is. If we listen to Doctor Doctor, we hear that sound. We hear the next sound of heavy rock and eventually heavy metal. It's there in 74 on UFO. This is how important UFO are. It's a sound that is different to Free. It's the sound that's different to Deep Purple. It's a sound that's different to Led Zeppelin. It's got elements of Black Sabbath. When we listen to Doctor, it has that chunking sort of Children of the Grave sort of rhythm to it. But the songwriting is much more concise, and it's just that little bit more removed from the blues. I think that's the key here. Schenker brings in a sort of slight neoclassical approach that we're then going to see with Uli John Roth, and then of course Yngwie Malmsteen, and that starts to creep in. Richie Blackmore, that's probably come from there as well. But with Doctor Doctor, for me, that is the sound. It's born here on that album. Is this UFO's best album? It's a great album. They get better. They really do. But it's an incredible album. Phenomenon. There is the glimpse of the future there at number 5. Talking about that blues rock approach, number 4, I've got Bridge of Sighs by Robin Trower. I absolutely love Robin Trower. Originally the guitarist in Procol Harum. He leaves Procol Harum, he gets himself a Strat, and he starts to pursue a certain aspect of Jimi Hendrix, which is possibly the sort of Band of Gypsies end of the Jimi Hendrix experience. Trower's got a sort of very psychedelic, relaxed, bluesy guitar approach, which I've always loved because it's fiery. It's still fiery. This band, which is a trio, is a very groovy, funky band. And in Bill Lordan, the late great Bill Lordan, on bass and vocals, we have a very funky bass player, but we have one of the greatest voices in rock, equal to a Robert Plant, equal to a Paul Rodgers. Bridge of Sighs and is an incredible album. My favourite album comes out the following year with Long Misty Days. It's just the Bridge of Sighs sound, just even tightened up a little bit more. But Bridge of Sighs is probably his greatest album to most people. It's an absolutely classic album. If you haven't heard it and you like Cream and you like Hendrix, go and check out Bridge of Sighs by Robin Trower. It's a masterpiece. So that's what I've got number 4. At number 3, I have the debut album of Rush. Rush have not found their sound on this album. They're still enthralled by Led Zeppelin and The Who. Right? They haven't got Neil Peart on drums. They've got John Rutsey on drums. There's no prog on here. This is a very Canadian take on Led Zeppelin. But what we do have are some killer songs and some killer riffs. Working Man is a killer riff. You know, Finding My Way is a killer riff. This is just a great rock album. Rush were an incredible rock band, and it's the only time we really see this. By the second album with Neil Peart joining, they've gone away with the fairies, haven't they? But they haven't here. This is gutsy. It's difficult for some because, you know, we've got the sort of Geddy Lee, Donald Duck on helium vocal sound that he has on this album, and that is difficult for some people. For me, I love this album in the same way as I loved all the other albums. I bought all the Rush albums. I, for some reason, didn't differentiate it because as a young guy, I think what was getting me with Rush was the riffs. And that's why Rush are one of the biggest bands in the world. Yes, they made a ton of progressive rock. Yes, they did Farewell to Kings. But there's a gutsiness and an urgency which, again, is opening the door to what's going to happen in rock music. It's that heavier and, in a way, moving away from the blues. And their inclination to move towards the sort of pastoral progressive rock areas is a testament to that intention that we hear on this album, you know. But I think it's also just the fact that Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson are just so bloody good, and that's what you hear on this Rush. Number 3. At number 2, I have Sabbath Bloody Sabbath by Black Sabbath. What an album! You know, Sabbath have invented heavy metal on their first album. They have then absolutely nailed it and almost invented progressive metal on their second album. And then you get Masters of Reality and you get Volume 4. And those albums are all your classic, turgid, dark Black Sabbath sound. No other heavy metal band has ever captured that sound. You know, Black Sabbath are really, like, they're the originators. And that's proper heavy metal. They don't need great thunderous drums. They don't need any screamy vocals. It's their own sound. Right? But again, they start to overreach themselves. There's an influence of progressive rock. They get more and more experimental. And on oh, I've lost me. Oh, this hasn't run out of power, has it? Oh no, I thought my list had run out of power. I was going to have to. Oh, without my list, I'm in trouble. Where was I? Black Sabbath, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. Here we see them at their experimental best. The albums that they're going to follow, they're going to get more experimental, more out there. You know, by Never Say Die, people who like Sabbath are going to find that difficult. The other day I stuck Never Say Die on, and I was blown away by it. There's a jazz rock track on there with saxophone. It's unbelievable. At the time as a kid, when I loved Sabbath and I heard Never Say Die, I hated it. But hearing it now, I thought, my God, this is a band at the peak of their powers. Obviously blitz out their face on cocaine, but all, you know, Volume 4 was made like that. That's a masterpiece. Sabbath Bloody Sabbath is an absolute masterpiece. And when I went through my heaviest riffs of all time, I think at number 2 we had that riff that comes out in the middle of Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. You know that bit. I won't do the Ozzy Osbourne yelp. I've spoken about that yelp too many times on this channel, and I will get waylaid, and I've got a lot to get through on this video. So I'm going to move on to my number 1. The greatest rock album, I think, of 1974 is Burn by Deep Purple. Alright? And I think the reason for that is because, again, Deep Purple, like Zeppelin and Sabbath, the cracks have shown, and it's happened. You know, Gillan's gone. You know, Roger Glover's gone. And so they have to reconvene. And they pull into incredible musicians, Glenn Hughes and David Coverdale, and it infuses the band in a certain way. And Deep Purple at this point starts to move closer to being a sort of soul-y R&B band. It's a really odd thing. It's the wrong choice. You know, but Richie Blackmore was right in terms of rock music. What he goes on to do in Rainbow is what's going to happen. You know, the end game for this album is going to be all those hair metal bands in the 80s, of which Whitesnake are going to personify it, you know. Burn is just, I think, Deep Purple, I've always had a problem with the studio albums. I think they're best when they're live. I think In Rock's incredible, Machine Head's great, but you always want to hear the live versions of it. Burn's no exception, but I think it's one of their most successful studio albums. It sounds brilliant. The drum sound of Ian Pace is just phenomenal, and the title track personifies it. Burn. That they come out and they do another Speed King and it just is so propulsive. And that there in that track is the elements that we're going to hear in heavy metal going forward. So that's my 5 favourite rock albums from 1974. They're all going to be 50 years old. As I was researching through this, I kept coming up across funk albums. I go, well, that's one of my favourite albums. Could I stick that on the rock list? Well, it's a little bit, and I thought, I can't stick it on the rock list. So I came up with so many funk albums, millions of them. I could have done a 20 favourite funk albums from 1974. Funk is at its peak. Funk is basically soul that has taken elements from rock music and drawn those in. James Brown's the first guy to do this, and Sly Stone does it, and then of course, you know, George Clinton, who's enthralled with bands like MC5, brings that psychedelic rock influence into it, and the funk is born, right? And so I have 5 albums here. I'm going to get through them quick. So at number 5, I have an obscure album, but one of my favourite funk albums of all time. It's called Everything I Gonna Do Gonna Be Funky From Now On, by the obscure jazz guitarist Donal Levi, or Levy. I don't know even how to say his name because I've never heard it pronounced by anybody who knows. This is a funky album, and it says what it is. This is a jazz guitarist who has made the decision that from now on, everything he's going to do, from now on, is going to be funky. Have you ever made that decision in your life? If you haven't, then you should. It sports a great big bottom. I might have to do a video just on album covers that have got bottoms on, because that means on the one video I could talk about Hemispheres by Rush, I could talk about Going for the One by Yes, and I could talk about this album all together and really explore the idea of bottoms on albums. But if we're going to have a number 1, I tell you, and I'll spoil it now, it will be this. This is the biggest bottom, and the bottom is being held by 2 hands, which I can only assume are the virtuoso fingers of Donal Levi. This is a funky album. It's on Groove Merchant Records, I know that. I can't tell anything else about it. I've had it for years. I got it for £1 in a second-hand shop, and I've always loved it, and that's what I've got there. So, at number 4, by Parliament, I have the first Parliament album, Up for the Downstroke. Funkadelic are great, but Funkadelic are a psychedelic rock band. There's funk influences in there, but Funkadelic is something else. The funk really happens when he forms Parliament. And with Up for the Downstroke, George Clinton, in terms of production, it's a little bit closer to the Funkadelic sound. The bass is a little bit more in your face. The drums are a little bit in your face. And it is my favourite album by Parliament, Funkadelic. And I think it's because the elements haven't come together. Up for the Downstroke is just one of the funkiest tracks of all time. It's heavy and it's raw. I think the production thins out. There's so much going on in the later albums. I've always had a little bit of a difficulty with that. Up for the Downstroke is absolutely wonderful. So that's what I've got on my number 4. Number 3, I have a masterpiece, right? His greatest album and one of the great albums of all time. I've never discussed it on this channel, but I've got Winter in America by Gil Scott-Heron, and the title track is an example of funk but also sublime songwriting that rivals a Joni Mitchell or a Bob Dylan. Gil Scott-Heron was a poet, and he's a poet on this album. I think it's this album's the one that's credited to Gil Scott-Heron and Brian Jackson, who brings that flute sound in. It's the classic funky jazz rock flute funk sound. It's a beautiful album, and if you find the funk a bit frivolous and silly, then this is the album for you, because this is serious. This is where we have the roots of hip hop and rap on that album. Number 3. At number 2, I have the Queen. The Queen, I love her so much. Shaka Khan with Rufus. The second album, Rufus Size, I think it's the second album, isn't it? This is where Rufus find their sound. And the thing about Rufus, it's just got a little bit more rock, there's a little bit more riffing. Shaka Khan is just one of the great discoveries of popular music. She can do anything. Her voice is absolutely incredible. She seems to hit any note effortlessly. You don't notice how high she's hitting, how hard she's hitting, the tone, the sound. She's absolutely off the scale. If there was ever a queen of funk, it's Chaka Khan. And Rufus Size is a perfect album. Every track is mind-blowing. Right? At number 1, I have Rejuvenation by the Meters. Yeah, Zigaboo, Model S, the great drummer that rivals Clyde Stubblefield in terms of importance. That's, yeah, what an album. What an album this is. What can I say about the Meters? I got into the Meters because I was reading an interview with Vinnie Colaiuta, and he said his favourite albums of all time. I remember it was Miles Davis, possibly. Which Miles Davis albums did he like best? It could be, I can't remember. My mind's gone blank. Nefertiti, I think. Tony Williams' Lifetime, Emergency, and Rejuvenation by the Meters. So I went out and bought Rejuvenation, and I also bought another sort of best of, which covered the earlier Meters tracks. Things, you know, like Sissy Strut and all that type of thing. I was blown away by the sort of linear grooves and the funkiness. That's New Orleans funk. It's a certain type of funk. Again, they're at their peak with Rejuvenation. It's just so funky. It's begat a million samples on a million hip hop records. It's a very funky album. I put it at number 1 because it is just so funky, and because I haven't discussed the Meters. I wish I knew more about them. I wish I could tell you more about the Meters. I don't know much about the Meters. The only other thing I can say about the Meters is that, and this has got nothing to do with the Meters, but it's a funny story. Many years ago, I had to pick up a drum kit that belonged to John Bonham from Robert Plant. I had to pick up the drum kit and Robert Plant and drive Robert to a place where we were going to photograph this drum kit. And I'm driving along, and I'm quite nervous because I've got John Bonham's kit in the boot and I've got Robert Plant sat next to me, and I start to have the weird thought, because I have these weird thoughts. I thought, if I crashed now and we all died, this would be the most famous thing I've ever done, which would be to kill Robert Plant and to destroy one of John Bonham's drum kits. That is how I would go down in history. And I got so nervous by the thought, this sort of inner compulsion to just pull the wheel off, you know, this suicidal tendency to pull the wheel off, you know, to gain immortality, you know, by wrapping my car around some tree, that I started to feel really edgy. And so I decided to put a CD on, and I had the Meters, I think it was Rejuvenation, on in the car. So I stick it on, and it comes on all funky. And then Robert, of course, when he was in Led Zeppelin, Zepp loved the Meters and would hire the Meters for their own events. They would have parties with the Meters as their sort of party band. Can you imagine that? And so he knew all the songs. So Robert, at the top of his voice, starts to sing along to the Meters. He's making up his own lyrics. He's singing up the lyrics, you know. And I tell you what it was. It wasn't Rejuvenation. It was Tie Your Pony. I gotta tie your pony. It was that one, I think. And Robert starts to sing it, and then I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm being serenaded in the car by Robert Plant to the Meters. That is a very memorable car journey. So, I've got to the end of this video. They were my 5 favourite funk albums and my 5 favourite rock albums from '74. There's one funk album that is not on this list. And I've deliberately not put it on because I want to talk about it on another video. And that's it. So I haven't forgotten it. It's Average White Band's second album, the one with Pick Up the Pieces on. I want to go back and reassess that album. It's an incredible album, and it is the last album to have Robbie McIntosh on drums, and I really want to do a video about Robbie McIntosh. I don't know how interesting that will be to the audience, but the story is so sad but also so compelling. It's a very compelling story, and I don't think it's fully been told. And so I thought if I put it on, I'm going to have to end up telling that story, and it's going to take a whole video up. So I have shelved that, but it's in there. Do I love it any more than the other albums on this list? Not really. These albums are much more closer to me than the average white band album is. But Pick Up the Pieces is so all pervasive, and it's an incredible track that went to #1 in the US and went to #7 in the UK here. And it's basically a jazz rock track. It's an instrumental funk track with solos. Yeah, they shout pick up the pieces, and that's your basic chorus. Why was this track so huge? Right? It was so ubiquitous when I was a kid. It was on the radio all the time. It seems to have lost its hold culturally now, I think. So I want to get into Pick Up the Pieces. I want to get up into that track particularly and discuss it on a separate video. So if you can just bear with me, don't be shouting out, because I know that album came out. So if you like this video, then please put a like on it, because it helps the channel. It really does. If you want to see some more and you're not subscribed, then subscribe. If you watched a couple of videos, subscribe. You can always unsubscribe. It's not going to get you. I'm not going to get you. Just put a subscribe on. I'm just bubbling under 19,000 subscribers, and when you're a YouTuber, you've always got that next target. So my next target is 20,000. And if all the people watching this just press a subscribe now that haven't subscribed, I'll go up to 20,000 probably. I'll probably have to get, nearly there at least. If you want to support me financially, you can become a patron. My patron's got all sorts of exciting things going on there. It's not just extra content. Yesterday I had Ken Golden from Laser's Edge, which is an American mail order prog and fusion label, and he came in and talked to my patrons. They were all in there. We had a big chat. He told loads of stories. He explained how the business worked, and he also started, I'm going to have to get him back in, but he started to discuss some of the rarer prog and fusion. This is like going direct to the horse's mouth. The next day I woke up and the patrons had emailed me, and they were like, oh, this was I really enjoyed that. He talked about hi-fis, he talked about mastering, he tells some stories from the industry, and it really, really interesting. I try and do that twice a month, so you get one of those, and then it's recorded, and those videos are in Patreon. So if you don't want to get involved, you can still see the extra content. There's loads of articles, there's loads of news, and there's extra videos, and where I can talk much more all over the place and not have to worry about having a title and a thumbnail that brings people in. So that's Patreon, but I know it's an investment in not just money but time. If you want to support me but not become a patron, then you can put a payment into my PayPal tip jar. I never ever do this at the beginning of the video. I don't bore you by saying can you like and subscribe. I only ever do it at the end, right? Because I hate it when people do that. So you can watch the video and then you can switch off as soon as I go into this talk. But if you're still watching this, please try and support the channel. I really want to get somewhere with this channel this year. I really have ideas that will not just benefit me, and I like benefiting me, but it won't just benefit me, it will also benefit the music. I have ideas of ways of reaching an audience and getting into the nooks and crannies, So, and I think we've done this over the last couple of years with certain artists. I think there's definitely with Herman Sabel. I think we have established him here on this channel as being something you've got to listen to, and there's an audience that has grown because of the channel, which is very exciting stuff, and we can keep doing that. But I need some support to do it, so if you can put a bit of money in the PayPal tip jar, that would be fantastic. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you on the next one.